As part of my exploration of classic vintage board games, in particular board games that seems to have been influenced by Dungeons and Dragons and early role-playing games, board games that seem to try to tell your story the way role-playing games do, but through board games means only. Well, in this series of videos about this specific topic, today I'm going to tell about Labyrinthine, a very obscure game published in 1977. Ideally, this video is a sequel of my video about Citadel, a game that came out the previous year, and I just released that video, so if you happen to watch that one, I think that you'll get more out of this video that I'm filming right now. Labyrinthine came out a year after Citadel. Many ideas are in common, and while Labyrinthine is not a great game per se by any means, I think it is interesting historically because, to my knowledge, it is the first fully modular dungeon crawler. So it is the first game where the dungeon, the player, is entirely built by using terrain tiles that represent rooms and corridors. The previous game, Citadel, had something similar, had a variable board made of non-variable rooms that, however, could be connected by using teleporting systems in different ways from games to games. But Labyrinthine, even when you look at it, it really looks much more similar than that a game does to modern games such as Legend of Dresde or Wrath of Ashardalon or even Shadows of Brimstone. So, interesting game. What you're seeing here is the cover, however, I do not have the physical copy. The game is extremely rare these days. I only saw a copy on eBay for an obscene amount. It was just being listed for a completely unreasonable price. And I'm looking for the game for research and review purposes. I'm writing a book actually about board games that tell stories, so I really need to fill the gaps between, say, Dungeons and Dragons, that clearly is a board game that tells stories, and modern games, and looking for these obscure little games that we may not know much about these days, but may have played a role in the development of a new style of board games. So looking at these games is important to me, so I needed to have access to this game. So I want to thank two Board Game Geek users, Andreas Stedding and Peter Bauer, who provided me with pictures of the game, of all the components of the game, so I was able to build my own copy, again, for research and review purposes only. I tried to look for who may have the copyright. The publisher doesn't exist anymore, is not in business anymore. I couldn't find a contact for any of the designers. If somebody knows of the person has the copyright and wants me to put in contact with that person, then I'll be happy to do so, so just let me know. For now, I built my own copy and I played it, I analyzed it, and I tried to get a sense of what role it may have played in the development of modern board games that tell stories. The story here is that of a party of fantasy heroes that are going down a dungeon trying to rescue a princess that has been kidnapped by the evil wizard and is being kept in a dungeon full of monsters. The game comes with a small booklet, well, like a thin booklet. This is the cover that you see here. Then you have an almost empty page here with the credits, and then the rules are like 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, 3.5 pages. Very short rules. And then you have a counter sheet with the monsters and the heroes, and then another couple of things, so tables with player rates and combat tables and things like that. Then you have terrain tiles. You have 15 sheets of terrain tiles that you need to cut to create the terrain of the game. Actually, since they are on common paper, not even on very thick paper, from the pictures that I saw, you would need to cut them and glue them on cardboard to make the terrain tiles sturdy. Actually, the rules also recommended you do that. So the publisher was aware of the fact that this publication was in need of some work before you could actually play the game. Anyways, Labyrinthine, the first fully modular dungeon crawler. Let's see how it works, how it plays, and what it's all about. Characters in the game are represented by counters such as these ones. I printed them and made them, and the ink in my printer was at a low. This is why the images look so faded. We'll say that there is a magic mist in the dungeon that makes visibility limited, and this is also why I had to use a pen to trace the stats so I could see them easily. Characters are identified by their identity, name, and image, which in most cases is not really important. It has to do with magic. Some characters have magic, so you want to know which that character is. Some other characters have other abilities. For example, the Hobbit is good at opening secret panels, but for example, for the monsters, they are usually not all that important. Only the stats are important, with the exception again of that certain magic, certain spells affect certain monsters rather than others. The number that you see there in the top left corner is the attack value of the creature. The letter in the top right corner is the armor class or the defense value, and here at the bottom you have the movement value, which is of 3 for most characters in the game. And also characters have a different amount of hit points, life points, health points, call them whatever you want, but those are recorded on another sheet. So the game is very innovative in that it is a modular game. It is a modular dungeon. The dungeon may change each time that you play the game, which is awesome potentially, but there are some logistical problems here that make playing the game a little laborious. Look at this. This is a big dungeon, right? These are all of the pieces of the dungeon that come with the game and that you're instructed to use. So it's a really large dungeon that takes a long time to set up. If you're setting up the game when the other player is sitting there, that's going to be very boring and tedious. You can set up your dungeon before the game starts, but then again, it's going to be a huge work for the person that sets up the dungeon. It's a two-player game, so one player is going to be the dungeon master, meaning really the owner of the dungeon, the evil person that controls the dungeon and the monsters in it, and the other player is going to be the party of heroes. So you can prepare it before, but again, also if you don't spend a long time, it will turn out that you are setting up kind of like randomly just to save some time to yourself, and you think it's a good dungeon. Then of course, as soon as the opponent looks at it in 2 minutes, the opponent will figure out a way to shoot through it that makes all of your work useless or of little value, because it turns out that it's easy for the opponent to find an easy way through. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the rules do not say exactly how you have to set up the dungeon, so conceivably, you could prepare it as pretty much of a monorail situation where the party of heroes is forced to go through like all or almost all pieces in the game. So you wouldn't have any dungeon feel at all there, and the game would be even more tedious than it already is. So it's a good idea. It's the first game that uses this idea, so you may expect the ideas to still be pretty unpolished, which it is, but pretty much you have to find the good dungeon master that wants to give you a dungeon feel, that wants to spend some time preparing a good dungeon, which is not impossible, but not too easy. So there are some hard elements there. One way of playing the game that is recommended in the rules is actually that you could play the games using a random dungeon. So you're simply drawing tiles like you would have later in games such as Wrath of Ashar, The Lone Legend of Dresde, which is great, but it really pretty much works only if you're playing the game solitaire, in which case it's great. You flip out new tiles, and there's a room. You also draw a random monster as you place it in there. If you're playing 2 players, then that version is going to be pretty boring for the evil player, because the evil player simply sits there, doesn't know what's going to happen. Monsters are added to the board, the evil player rolls for the monsters to attack, and that's all the evil player does. Anyways, you need to set up the dungeon, and you need to place an objective for the player, for the good player to catch. The objective is the princess. The princess is placed face up because the good guys had information as to the location of the princess in the dungeon. Really gamey, but at least you know where you're going. Also, the monsters that the evil player controls are placed face down on the board, no more than one per room. There are also some special enemies that are controlled by the evil player that are placed face down in hallways. These are guards. They are the only monsters, or say enemies, of the good guys that can move at the beginning of the game, that the card does need to be alerted. And so you could distinguish them simply from the fact that they are in hallways rather than in rooms, but I colored their back differently to mark them more easily, to make them more easily visible. Also, you say, why don't you just put them face up and everybody else is face down? Good question, my friend. Thank you for paying attention. The fact is that one of those guards or guard pieces is not a guard at all. It is a dummy. So I don't want the opponent to know which one is my dummy. I want to trick my opponent. As the evil player designs the dungeon, the evil player also needs to place doors. There are different types of doors. This is a walled door. That is a panel. I think he means kind of like a secret passage. Mind you, you know where it is on the map, but it's very secret. And then there you have a regular door. To open doors, the heroes need to be adjacent to the door, and then they need to roll a die. Different types of heroes have different chances of opening different types of doors. There is a table there that tells you the number that you need to roll on a d6 to be able to open a certain type of door. The Hobbit, for example, is very good at opening panels, but cannot open walled doorways. The dwarf is very good at that, and not equally good at other things. Actually, the dwarf is the one that is pretty much the best one that is able to do a little bit of everything. The hero specializes in walking through doors, but is not really good at finding secret panels. It's not really a subtle hero at all. The dungeon master, the evil player that controls the dungeon, also needs to place entrances to the dungeon, multiple ones, and multiple exits. Then the player, the good guy with the party of heroes, will enter the dungeon, and I haven't found in the rules exactly how many heroes you can bring in. There are 8 of them. I assume you go in with all of them, or you can experiment with different numbers if that seems too easy for one side. And sequence of play is pretty simple. First, the good guy goes, the party of hero goes, and the first things that they do in their turn, following the sequence of play, is that if the party of heroes has heroes that are adjacent to doors that are still closed, the adjacent character can try to open them using the table that I just showed you. So you roll a die for the character adjacent to a door, and you see if the door gets open. Then you have a magic phase where your characters that have magic may get to act. So as you can see there, in this order, the she-elf, then the elf, and then the magic user, that would be the wizard, gets to use magic if they so wish. And here you have a table with the special abilities of the characters that have special abilities. And as you can see, the elf and the she-elf and the magic user are there. Elf and she-elf pretty much become invisible, which allows them to move around enemies. And the magic user has fireballs, which are super neat because they automatically give damage. The hobbit, as you can see, is a little tougher to hit if he wants to dodge. And the priest is really good against undead, but particularly weak, in pretty much all and every other combat situation. So you first... we're still in the hero phase. Heroes try to open doors, then they may cast spells if they so wish. Then they get to move up to their full movement allowance. The rules don't tell me if diagonal movement is okay. I ruled then it is not. If you are in line of sight of enemies, you also see the enemies, you reveal them. Oh, look, a guard. And as you're moving, if you move adjacent to an enemy, then the enemy has a zone of control. There's a zone of control in all squares adjacent to an enemy. Again, in this game, I decided not to count diagonals, so in a room such as this one, the zone of control would be of only 4 squares. Would have like the shape of a cross. I simply decided to not use diagonals in the game. It makes more sense to me this way. If you move into a zone of control, oh look, we opened the door, yay! If you move adjacent to an enemy in the zone of control, then you have to stop moving. You cannot move further for that turn. You said this game uses a typical war game concept, and you have to attack. After movement, there is a combat, there is melee combat, and then there is a counterattack from the... From whom? From the enemies that were attacked, from the enemies that are adjacent to you, I assume from all enemies that are adjacent to you. The rules do not explain anything specific about counterattacks. They just talk about situations when the opponent doesn't counterattack, but they don't tell exactly how you counterattack. So I simply played that counterattack means that the opponent gets a chance of hitting at you after you attack them. And then you record damage. How does combat work? A typical chainmail / early D&D situation, and also like later versions of D&D and many other games. But at the time, in a game that is so clearly inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, this is pretty obvious, the resemblance in the combat system. In chainmail and early D&D, you simply cross-referenced on a table your quality of attack with the quality of the enemy as defense. You received a hit number, and then you rolled in chainmail two six-sided dice, in early D&D a 20-sided die, and if you had equaled or exceeded the target number, then you would hit the opponent. The same here exactly. Remember, the quality of the attack is expressed in a number, the quality of the defense in a letter. You cross-reference, that tells you the result, the target number. Roll 2d6s, exactly like in chainmail, and you resolve the attack. Well, yeah, you resolve the attack, which may be a hit or a miss, and that would be it. I didn't see anything in the rules about different amounts of damages for different types of wounds, different types of weapons or situations. So I assume that each hit reduces the opponent by a single life point, which makes the game super mega tedious because some enemies really have a lot of hit points. Even defeating a simple goblin takes at least 2 rounds of combat or 2 people working together. This is the sheet that tells you how many hit points people have and that you use to record that. Again, the printer, my printer had low ink, so I had to use my pen to redraw some of the things that didn't show up clearly. But it works well. Even if you have this sheet, then you can simply mark boxes until you have marked all of the empty boxes. These ones are marked at the beginning of the game to give you a sense of the different amounts of health points that they have. What I do actually in actuality is to add wooden cubes on these tracks to keep track of how many hit points each monster, each creature has lost, and the same applies to the heroes that also, as you can see, have different survival abilities. They have different chances of surviving because they have different amounts of health points. The hobbit, the priest, and the princess having very little life, very little amounts of life. So you record damage on that sheet, and then the opponent, the evil player, gets to act. You can move a guard or a dummy unit in any hallway. Then you can move any unit in line outside of the party. Then if there are guards adjacent to a door, and in the room behind the door there is an unalerted creature, an older monster, you roll a d6, and if you roll d6, you alert the creature. Finally, all alerted room inhabitants move, trying of course to reach the heroes and to attack them. They move, attack, and get counterattacked exactly like the heroes do. They receive damage exactly like the heroes do. And at that point, the turn is over, and you repeat. The objective for the evil player is to kill all of the good guys. The objective for the good player is to rescue the princess. Once you reach her, she becomes a member of your party, and to guide her out of the dungeon. Labyrinthine is a truly uninteresting game per se, but it is very interesting to me for historical reasons, for the missing link aspect that it has between earlier forms of RPG-oriented board games such as Citadel and later ones such as the Sorcerer's Cave or the Mystic Wood that I reviewed recently. Uninteresting because it is so dry, monotonous, and repetitive. Because you have a dungeon which looks great, looks like the modern dungeons in modern dungeon crawlers, and it is so empty. It feels so cold. I get agoraphobic in those rooms where there is nothing but a rat that I defeat, and that's it. Um, it is, by the way, however, a system that adds more detail in a sense than the previous game in our lineage, which is Citadel. In Citadel, you had empty rooms with some cosmetic things drawn on the board, but in reality, no game effects related to those. So you had an empty dungeon with very abstract monsters and heroes. Here, at least, the heroes and the monsters have more personality, they act in more unique ways, they borrow the combat system from Chainman and early D&D, but they added characters that act in different ways, that have unique abilities, so we have more interesting characters and more interesting monsters. You can see actually the level of detail growing from abstract dungeon and abstract characters in Citadel, more detailed characters and still abstract dungeon, abstract landscape in Labyrinthine, and then you have the Sorcerer's Cave that came out the following year that had the full modular board that seemed to have been inspired in any case to follow the same idea that you have in Labyrinthine, but you also have more interesting characters that behave in unique ways, and finally you have a dungeon that does not only has monsters but also has encounters, has events, has treasures. Finally, the treasures. You have rooms that behave in unique ways, they have specific things. In the Sorcerer Caves you do not have many of those, but you have some. And then you have the sequel of the Sorcerer's Cave, the Mystic Woods, where the terrain is even more interesting, the characters are more unique, they have unique missions, etc, etc. So when I reviewed the Sorcerer's Cave 2 weeks ago, I was looking at it from the contemporary perspective, from our perspective, and it really seems you drew rudimentary, and it still does from our perspective. But if you look at the development of the genre, what was before that, then it turns out that it was one of the most flavorful, sophisticated, refined, and thematically rich games around. It definitely was much better in that department than Citadel or Labyrinthine. Labyrinthine remains interesting because it is the first fully modular board game, fully modular dungeon crawler that I know. And if you know of early ones, please let me know. This is very important for my research. This is also why I'm sharing my ideas with you, so I can get feedback and I can learn from the community of gamers out there. But as far as I know, this is an interesting innovation that there was here, that a new element was added that then would become so successful and so popular in fantasy gaming, and not only since. But those rooms are still empty. We're still missing the joy of exploration, because at the end I see the dungeons, so I know exactly what's gonna be where. I don't know which kind of monster I'm gonna get, but I know that behind that counter there's gonna be a monster. I don't know if it's stronger or weaker, but I know it's a monster. That limits the joy of exploration. There is no true surprise. There is a small range of possibilities of what I'm going to encounter. Of course, again, it will take a while before we start having interesting event cards, and maybe event cards that are not all used in every game, so that there is more surprise, because I'm never going to be sure whether a certain event is going to happen or not. Events that present me with branches, with branching trees of options, etc, etc. Labyrinthine is not there yet. Again, framing it historically, it is good that it added something more to the genre with this new interesting map, and it added more to the representation, the description of the characters and their unique profiles. It is still lacking, and in terms of gameplay, when you play it, it's still repetitive. I mean, you can still see that it comes out of the same word game environment, word game background that Dungeons and Dragons came from, but in a sense it is almost like the word game mentality of somebody who hasn't played many word games and thinks that the important thing in word games is to fight. And that's all that you do in this game, really. Well, you roll dice to open doors, but other than that, roll, fight, no particular satisfaction, personal increase, level, experience point, treasures in fighting, just the joy of slaughtering opponents, which if really that is all that there is after a while, it gets old, and if a seasoned wargamer such as myself say so, then you can trust that that is what happens. When that is the only thing, then that is not enough to keep the interest of the average gamer, not even somebody who enjoys conflict simulations such as myself. A game that is interesting is showing us the influence, the great impact that Dungeons & Dragons had. This definitely is a game that has been influenced by Dungeons & Dragons because of the dungeon right there, the attempt of giving you a dungeon, and trying to address one of the caveats that Gygax already gave you in the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which was designing a good dungeon is going to take a long time. Almost the idea of having a board and you can just throw the tiles on the table clearly can be seen as a way of simplifying that process, as the designer of the Sorcerer's Cave would say. That's why he designed the Sorcerer's Cave. However, it still takes so long to come up with your dungeon. At the end is empty. So either you do then come up with completely made up encounters so that you have to create. So basically you are turning the game into an RPG at the end, so you may just as well play an RPG. So either you do that, or creating a dungeon still takes so much time that is really not all that worth the effort. Is not all that worth. But definitely you have the dungeon feel that comes from Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't such a common theme in literature or gaming before. And you have other two typical Dungeons and Dragons things, which are hobbits and balrogs. They both are creatures represented in the game, and you're thinking, what's wrong with Marco? How are hobbits and balrogs a typical Dungeons and Dragons things? They are, or I should say they were, in the early editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Those are creatures that were in the early editions of Dungeons and Dragons in 1974 and in the following reprints. Ents also were there. So yes, they come from Tolkien and they've been borrowed by Gygax and Arneson. And they were mentioned as such as hobbits, balrogs, and ents in the first couple of reprints until TSR received a gentle, kind invitation from the Tolkien estate to desist. Otherwise, there will be legal consequences. And that's why we have halflings, not because the name is so much more musical than hobbit, which it is. I like halfling much better. But there is a legal reason why halflings became halflings, ents became tree ents, and balrogs, I don't remember how they got renamed or removed or remade, or maybe they got some makeup and turned into some other sort of demon. So you have those elements that back in the day were typical. When you again you have, okay, you may say, well, maybe the guy was just influenced by Tolkien. Yes, but when you have hobbits and dungeons of that kind, then it's closer to D&D, which had both, than to Tolkien that really doesn't have the dungeon experience, don't deal as much. Yes, I'm aware about Moria and the caverns down there and what happens. You do not have the kind of experience. It's not as prominent an element as in Dungeons and Dragons, especially in the early days, the characters would spend months under like 15, 20 level dungeons. That really was the main thing. In Dungeons and Dragons, it is really a main thing here. An early attempt to turn Dungeons and Dragons into a board game, a failed attempt by contemporary standards, an improvement on an even more disappointing early attempts such as Citadel, and something that will pave the way to future designers trying to do the same, and designers that will do it better, such as the designer of the Sorcerer's Cave and the Mystic Wood. Labyrinthine, if you see that copy that's there on eBay for hundreds of dollars, don't get it, because this is not that great of a game. If you want to analyze it in more detail than the information that you have from me, well then by all means, but really I don't see much interest in this game but for historical reasons. For those reasons, however, great. To me it's phenomenally interesting because it does give me a sense of how complex and how gradual the passage was from D&D to modern dungeon crawlers that are so detailed, full of adventure, full of story, when you see how there's this gradual increments of story theme and richness of detail across several games to get to modern dungeon crawlers, to me is fascinating to see that gradual, complicated increase in complexity and detail. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from several games that did a lot of trial and error, a lot of error in particular, but we needed those intermediate steps to get to the points where we are now with such fun, sophisticated and interesting dungeon crawlers such as Shadows of Brimstone or D&D board games such as Legend of Dresd or Temple of Elemental Evil. Labyrinthine, 1977, another piece of the puzzle in the history of board games. I hope you're interested in these things. I hope you are enjoying my videos, my walks or explorations down memory lane of board games that people used to play back then, and especially board games that were trying to tell stories. It was the first time that people were trying to do that. They were still doing it in pretty clumsy, awkward ways, but at least we should give them some credit for trying to start with it. It was a new thing, it was a hard thing. It is not surprising that they failed, but I think it is still remarkable that at least they tried.